Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this Warlord mouse, which I built a while ago. This is a resin and metal model and I was pleasantly surprised by its quality. If you want to see the build video, there's a link in the description and in the card in the upper right corner of the screen now. Enough jibber jabber, let's get to painting. I start, as one might expect, by priming. For this I used AK Interactive black primer and microfiller, though pretty much any black primer will do. For this tank I decided I would try adding a pre-highlight with Vallejo Model Air White. I mostly spray this along the top of the turret, though a significant amount did also go onto the sides. I also applied it to the hull, and I put less white on the sides there. The hope here is that it will make the base coat look subtly lighter on the top of the model. Moving on to the base coat, I wanted to use Vallejo Middlestone for this, but I didn't have enough of that left to cover this quite large model, and I didn't want to wait for it to arrive, so I used Italeri flat Panzer Dunkelgelb instead, which works just as well in my opinion. I spray this on in a few light coats. This model doesn't have a ton of tiny little details that would be obscured by heavy coats of paint or anything like that, but it will still look better for being painted this way. Obviously I'm using an airbrush and will be for a lot of this paint job, but I'm sure similar results wouldn't be too hard to replicate with a regular brush. Make sure to paint all of the areas that should be yellow, including the road wheels and the bottom edges of the armour. And of course it's important to not forget about the turret. I think I applied this a little bit too heavily for the pre-highlighting to be very obvious, but I'm not especially bothered by that. It's still visible, at least in person. Probably not really worth the effort though unless I'm going to make it less subtle by doing even lighter base coats, but oh well, it was worth trying. I can add more highlighting anyway, which I do, using a mix of roughly 3 parts of the Dunkelgelb mixed to 1 part Vallejo model colour buff. I apply this how you might expect highlights to be added, along the sharp edges and corners of the model and mostly on the upper surfaces. The idea is to make it look a little bit sun-faded and like the model is in sunlight, but not to the extremes that some people go to. I'm not really a fan of extreme highlighting. I try not to go too heavy with this, but there were some areas that I went a teensy bit overboard with, but this is fine. It's pretty close to the base colour anyway. I then move away from the spray booth to brush on additional highlights. This is roughly 3 parts Dunkelgelb to 2 parts buff, but it's not a precise mix. I tend to do a lot of eyeballing when it comes to mixing colours. Blindly following formulas is a bit silly anyway. I much prefer making adjustments to a mix to my taste on the fly. I apply the dry brushing to pretty much the same areas that I just highlighted with the airbrush. It's just a little bit more focused on the edges, and that should add a kind of gradient look to the effect. This is pretty easy to do. I am of course using my makeup brush, and if you want to see a video about that, there's a link in the description. Of course, the turret should receive the same treatment. There's a bit more detail here, like the bolts on the gun mantlet that I'm trying to hit, though I am trying to hit those quite lightly. Same with the hatches and vision devices, though I think those are more likely to be faded than those bolts. I think this is fairly good, but I feel like adding another highlight would be good too, so I made another mix of Dunkelgelb and buff. This time it was more like 50-50, and again I dry brush it on. I apply this pretty much the same as the last dry brushing, but a little bit lighter. I don't want to obscure the previous layer, rather I want to enhance it a bit. I mostly apply this along the hard edges, but also gently on the bolt heads on the gun mantlet. I think it's worked quite nicely. Next I move back to the spray booth to apply some camo. First I apply model colour reflective green. I carefully and slowly spray this, with the pressure quite low and the paint thin. It unsurprisingly goes on lightly, so I do have to go back over most of the bits, which is fine. The effect I'm trying to achieve here is to have it look like a couple of guys at the training ground, or wherever it was they were keeping this thing, sprayed the camouflage on really quickly before it was sent out to fight. I'm not really following a specific pattern, so my lines are kind of random, and I think the result looks okay. The lines aren't super consistent in coverage and it looks a bit rough in places, but that's the effect I was going for. I'm doing this with the turret on so that the camo pattern will line up from hull to turret, in case that wasn't obvious. Once I'm done adding the camo, I take the turret off and continue the lines on the hull, just to make sure the camo doesn't suddenly end when the turret is turned. I'm satisfied enough with this to move on to the brown, for which I used Vallejo German Camouflage Medium Brown. I apply this in pretty much the same way as the green. As you can probably see, I'm actually following the green lines for the most part. In some spots there's a tiny bit of space between the green and brown. I feel like that helps it to look more like the camo was applied quickly before sending the tank out to fight. I'm pretty sure it didn't fight in real life, but this is for a game, not real life. I took some basic inspiration for this from some images of the mouse I found on Google and the way it's painted at Kubinka now, though it's obviously not an exact replication of that. I went back and forth a couple of times touching up the green or brown here and there, but eventually I was happy enough with what I had, so it's back to the desk where I apply a thin layer of Army Painter Strong Tone. This was thinned roughly 1 part Strong Tone to 2 parts water, and I apply it all over the model, trying to avoid letting it pool up. This should add some depth to the gaps as well as giving the paintwork a dirty look. I try to avoid leaving any streaks with my brush, but it looks as though they might appear anyway. To deal with that, I brush the wash on in downward strokes on the big slab sides. I used a fairly big brush to apply this, which I think was a sensible idea. The wash has definitely made the mouse look quite dirty, maybe like it's been parked for a while in a yard with a lot of dust and dirt around, which is kind of what I was going for. As you can see, instead of the plastic cup, I've now blue tacked the turret to a pill bottle filled with water, which seems to offer better stability. It is quite a heavy turret. I then applied gloss varnish to the sides of the turret, and then a decal on each side. I don't know what I did with the video of that process, but I can't find it. I'm sure you all know what applying decals looks like anyway. There was nothing tricky about it. For those interested, the decals came from a Rubicon sheet, because none were supplied with the mouse kit. Moving on, it's time to add some chipping, using my usual foam chipping method. The colours I used here were a rough mix of 40% Vallejo mahogany brown and 60% black grey. Again, this is not a precise mix. I roughly eyeball it and add more of one or the other colour until I'm satisfied with it. Obviously that means it will look slightly different from model to model depending on how I felt that day. I feel like it's better to judge how you're doing by eye, rather than strictly adhering to specific paint mixes every time. I then use the same colour mix and add some long scratches using a fine brush. Doing these I take my time and try to get the scratches as nice, fine and straight as I can. Obviously I don't want them to look like strokes of paint that have just been brushed on. In this kind of situation, less is often more, at least in terms of the actual paint applied. I did actually apply quite a few of these scratches, maybe a few too many for some people's taste, but I think they're fine. The story for this vehicle that I have in my head is that it has been sitting around in a yard before being sent to fight. Maybe the careless employees there are responsible for all those scratches. Next, I paint the tracks. I used model colour black grey for this and I applied it with a fairly big brush for the initial large surfaces of the tracks. It's pretty simple, put the grey on the tracks and not anywhere else. Be sure not to miss all the little spaces between the track links along the edge of the tracks. To paint in between the wheels and the tyre around the wheels, I step down to a smaller brush. I'm not entirely sure if the rim around the outside of the wheel is actually a rubber tyre, or if it's metal. I've decided to leave the outside of the wheels Dunkelgelb and only paint the outer area of the wheel that contacts the tracks with the grey. I think it looks better that way. Next, I highlight the tracks with a dry brush of Vallejo model colour London Grey. This dry brushing is just meant to give the tracks a bit of interest and variation under the enamel track wash that'll be coming next. Though before that, I apply a coat of gloss varnish over the entirety of the model. Now it's time for that AK Interactive track wash. This is thinned just a little bit with white spirit, no precise measurements here. The reason for the thinning is that I'm not trying to get a totally solid colour here. I want the greys beneath it to show through a little bit and affect the overall colour. This is a rather simple thing to apply. Clearly I only want it to go on the tracks themselves and not the surrounding areas, so that's where I put it. Being an enamel, it can of course be cleaned up very easily. The gloss layer I applied will help with that, but to avoid doing the extra work, it's always good to go as slowly and carefully as you need to avoid making mistakes. At this stage, I might apply a wash to the gaps and such, but I didn't really feel like it was necessary. They already look fairly good and dark from the strong tone I applied earlier. So what I did next was paint the exhausts, or what I am assuming are the exhausts, with AK Interactive rust streaks. The idea is that this will make it look like the heat has cooked the paint off and they've rusted. I found I had to do a couple of coats to this to make it look decent. Then I figured the vents on the top of the hull didn't quite look dark enough on the inside, so I thinned out some black artist's oil to make a thin black wash. If you want to do that, you'll definitely have to figure out the mix ratios yourself. I ended up using quite a bit of thinner because the artist's oils that I have are almost solid. As you can see, I applied this in all the openings of the vents. It gives them quite a bit of depth, which I feel adds interest and breaks up the model nicely. Once the wash is in the gaps, I clean up the outer surfaces with clean thinner on a brush, and by dabbing at it with a paper towel. Try not to linger with the paper towel, you don't want parts of it to stick. I also applied this into the ends of the gun barrels to give them a nice appearance of depth. I also apply this around the gun mantlet where it joins the turret. I figure that's a kind of subtle touch, but it does add to the model a little bit. Then I add another coat of gloss varnish, and after that I decided it might be a good idea to add some grime. Instead of the dark streaking grime that I often use, I figured I might try AK Interactive streaking grime for dark yellow vehicles, which I suppose this tank is. I don't want to go overboard with this, so I try to apply it minimally. The main areas I apply this are streaking down from the exhausts and from the headlamps, though those are certainly not the only areas I apply this. It's not too hard to do. You can always clean it off with some clean thinner and a brush if you make a mistake, and you can do that as many times as you want until you either get it right or run out of paint. I also applied this on the sides of the turret coming down from those holes, whatever they're for, and around the bolts on the gun mantlet. I see this as really more of an artistic thing than a precise technique. It's mostly a case of looking at your work and deciding if you like it or not, and if you don't like it, you keep working on it. Next, I sprayed the exhausts and the surrounding areas with a light airbrushing of black primer to represent soot buildup. I didn't want to go too far with this because I don't imagine the mouse has been running too much, certainly not enough to be covered in a heavy buildup of soot. In case you are wondering why you can't see me spraying that, it's because I'm a numpty and either I didn't press record or I lost the file somehow. Either way, you can see what I did, and I'm sure you can imagine how it looked while I was doing it. I couldn't think of anything else that needed to be done, so I applied a layer of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, which kills off the shine quite nicely indeed. Then it's time to add some finishing touches. First, I apply some AK Interactive fuel stains to the area around and below the fuel cap, obviously on the big fuel tank on the rear. The people that rushed painting this probably also rushed fueling it and made a bit of a mess. This is pretty easy to apply. I simply streak it downwards as gravity would do. I also use a clean brush with thinner on it to, well, thin it out a little bit. It looks okay, though I think maybe applying this before and after the matte varnish is probably actually the way to go. I think it does look a bit better on the Firefly. Then I take my 2B pencil and rub it along the sharp edges and raised bits of the tracks, just to suggest a slight gleam of worn and recently used tracks. I don't want the tracks to be shiny, I just want hints of shine at certain viewing angles. You may note that I've not applied any dust effects. I didn't really feel like the mouse needed that. I could of course reconsider that and add some later, but I probably won't. And so that's it. The mouse in 28mm scale by Warlord Games is now painted. I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. It is a simple paint job, but that's not really a bad thing. It doesn't need to be complicated to look good, and sometimes less is more, at least in my opinion. I'm really glad I got this tank now. Initially I was a bit reluctant to buy it because, well, it's resin. Those of you who've been around the channel for a while will probably know that I'm not so into resin models. You've seen some of the previous ones I've built and been a bit disappointed by, but this one is really quite nice, and I think I've made it look even nicer with my painting. The paint scheme I applied is more or less one imagined by me, though loosely based on various images of the mouse that I've seen on the internet, and it's roughly based on some black and white pictures I saw and the example at Kubinka, though like I said earlier it's not an exact replication and it's not intended to be such. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling. I don't really have anything else to say that hasn't been said in the video already. Hopefully some of the things I've demonstrated here are helpful for you. If you're curious or you just want to plain old copy the colours I've used here, there's a list of all the colours I've used in the description as usual. If you have any questions or you just want to let me know what you think, put that in the comment section below. And if you've painted your own mouse, feel free to share it on the miniatures channel on my Discord server. We'd all love to see it. And if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, and watch me livestream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon or perhaps by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below, and as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.